A field on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. Cold ground. March air that hasn't decided if it's still winter. A railroad worker is walking his usual route when something in the grass stops him. Not a shape he recognizes at first. Then it resolves into something he will never forget. A young woman, face down, partially clothed, 4 miles from the nearest dorm room. It's the morning of March 6th, 1994. And somewhere across the city, a family is about to get the phone call that ends one version of their life and begins another. She was 18 years old. She had been on this earth for exactly 1 semester as a college freshman. She had a full scholarship. She had a track medal in a drawer somewhere. She had, as far as anyone could tell, no enemies, no dangerous secrets, no reason at all to end up in that field. And in the hours before dawn, walking down an alley barely wide enough for a car, she vanished. Who took her? How he got away with it for 12 years. And what, of all things, finally brought him down, none of it will make sense until you understand who Stephanie Hummer was and how ordinary, how safe, that last walk home was supposed to be. This is the story of Stephanie Hummer. Before Columbus, before the alley, before any of it, there was a kid from Finneytown, a quiet suburb on the north side of Cincinnati, who ran track and edited her high school yearbook, and by every account left behind, made people feel like she was actually listening when they talked to her. Stephanie Lynn Hummer grew up the daughter of Dan and Sue Hummer. Not a family that made headlines. Not a family that wanted to. Just parents raising a daughter in a part of Ohio where nothing much happens, and nobody minds that. She graduated from Finneytown High School in 1993. If you'd asked anyone in that building to describe her, the words would have repeated themselves. Bright, kind, going somewhere. She ran track. She worked on the yearbook, not just contributed to it, edited it, which tells you something about how much her school trusted her judgment, her work ethic, her eye for what mattered. Yearbook editors are the ones who decide what a graduating class remembers about itself. That's not a small responsibility to hand an 18-year-old. Somebody looked at Stephanie and decided she could carry it. And she earned something a lot of 18-year-olds only dream about. A full scholarship to Ohio State University, awarded through the Evans Scholars Foundation, a program built specifically for students who had worked, often literally, to earn their place at the table. She wasn't coasting into college on family money or an easy legacy admission. She had built her own way in, 1 grade and 1 shift and 1 application at a time. In the fall of 1993, she packed up and left Finneytown for Columbus. A freshman, a track athlete trading 1 uniform for a new one. A girl with, by every account that survives her, a genuinely bright outlook and 0 reason to believe the world had anything but good things waiting on the other side of that move. She had no idea she had 6 months left. Columbus, in the winter of 1993, sliding into 1994, was for an Ohio State freshman exactly what you'd picture. Dorms with cinder block walls and string lights. Parties that started too early and ended too late. The university district, that stretch of bars, corner stores, and cramped student apartments, pressed right up against campus, alive at almost every hour with the particular, invincible energy of 18 to 22-year-olds who genuinely believe nothing bad happens to people like them. Stephanie had made friends. She was doing what freshmen do, going out, staying later than she'd probably planned, walking home through streets and alleys she had already walked dozens of times without a second thought. That's how a college campus works. You learn its geography fast, and once you know it, it stops feeling dangerous. It starts feeling like your own backyard. There was nothing, in the days leading up to March 6th, that anyone later flagged as unusual. No threats whispered in a hallway. No arguments overheard through a dorm wall. No strange phone calls that a roommate would replay in her head for years afterward, wondering if she'd missed a sign. That absence matters. It's part of what makes this case sit so uneasily with people. Even 3 decades later, there was no slow-building storm anyone could point to. There was an ordinary Friday night on a college campus in Ohio. And then, without warning, there wasn't. That is the thing about the worst nights of people's lives. They almost never announce themselves in advance. They arrive disguised as any other night, indistinguishable right up until the moment they aren't. Think about how many students, on any given weekend, walk exactly the same kind of route Stephanie walked. Think about how many of them make it home without incident, night after night, year after year, and never once think about it again by morning. That's part of what made this so hard for the people who loved her to process afterward. It wasn't a reckless decision. It wasn't a wrong turn down some unfamiliar street in a part of town she didn't know. It was a walk home that thousands of other students had made safely before her, and one that she herself had almost certainly made safely dozens of times that same school year. On the evening of March 5th, 1994, Stephanie was out with friends in the University District, the same blocks, the same bars and apartment stoops that thousands of OSU students moved through every single weekend of the school year. By every account that survives, it was an unremarkable night. Nothing that stood apart from any other Friday she'd spent in Columbus that semester. Sometime in the early hours of March 6th, investigators would later place it somewhere between 2:30 and 3:30 in the morning. Stephanie said her goodbyes and started walking home. Her route took her through Pearl Alley, a narrow passage close to her dormitory, not far at all from her own front door. It was the kind of shortcut students take without thinking twice, because they have taken it 100 times before and nothing has ever happened. That's exactly what a shortcut is supposed to be, the safe, familiar, boring way home. She never made it home, and because it was the middle of the night, because 18-year-olds sometimes stay out later than they'd told their roommates, because there was no immediate reason yet to assume the absolute worst, the alarm didn't sound right away. Hours passed before anyone understood something had gone catastrophically wrong. That gap, between the moment Stephanie disappeared and the moment anyone realized she was actually missing, is one of the quiet, aching tragedies buried inside this entire case. In that gap, whatever happened to her happened, unwitnessed and unstopped. Investigators would later conclude she was abducted somewhere along that alley. There were no known witnesses. In a district packed with students coming and going at every hour of the night, somehow, nobody saw a thing worth remembering. And however her attacker moved her away from that alley on foot, in a vehicle, by force, nobody standing on Pearl Alley that night could ever account for it afterward. She simply stepped off the map. Roughly 10 hours after Stephanie vanished, a railroad worker doing his normal rounds came across something in a field. 4 miles from her dorm, face down, partially clothed. It was Stephanie. Word moved through Columbus fast, and then it moved south to Cincinnati, and then it arrived at the Hummer family's front door, in the form of the call every parent prays they never receive. Dan and Sue Hummer's daughter, the girl who had edited the yearbook, who had run track under Ohio skies, who had just started building the life they had raised her to build, was gone. Not missing, gone. The scene in that field, the officers arriving, the tape going up, the quiet horror of confirming what everyone already feared, before the confirmation ever came. None of it needs graphic description to convey what it meant. A family lost a daughter with no warning at all. A campus lost a freshman nobody had a bad word to say about. And a killer, at that point, had no name, no face, and no reason anyone could yet see. News of Stephanie's death moved through Ohio State the way this kind of news always moves through a college campus fast, disbelieving, and then settling into something closer to fear. Students who had walked those same alleys without a second thought suddenly found themselves looking over their shoulders. Roommates started walking each other home. What had felt, just days earlier, like an unremarkable stretch of pavement between a bar and a dorm room, became, almost overnight, a place people avoided after dark. That kind of shift in a community's sense of safety doesn't show up in a police report, but it's real, and it lingers long after the headlines move on to something else. The autopsy confirmed what investigators had already feared standing in that field. Stephanie had been raped. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, meaning this wasn't an accident. Wasn't a robbery that spun out of control. Wasn't anything that could be softened or explained away as something other than exactly what it was. Whoever did this had taken an 18-year-old girl off a public street in the middle of a college campus district, assaulted her, and killed her, then carried or drove her 4 miles away and left her in an open field, as if distance alone could erase what he had done. There was one thing working quietly in the investigation's favor, even in an era before forensic science had caught up to what it is today. Crime scene technicians recovered DNA evidence. In 1994, DNA testing existed, but the databases needed to actually use it to compare an unknown sample against a pool of possible suspects were nowhere near what they'd eventually become. What investigators had, in effect, was a key with no matching lock in sight. It went into evidence storage, and it would sit there, sealed and waiting, for more than a decade, while technology and Ohio law slowly caught up to what this one piece of evidence could someday do. What followed was, by every account, one of the most intensive investigations the Columbus Division of Police had undertaken in years. Detectives, among them Officer Pat Barr, who reportedly kept a photograph of Stephanie on his desk for years, as the case dragged on unresolved, conducted hundreds of interviews. Volunteers combed the area around the field and the alley. Tips poured in by the dozens, then by the hundreds. The university district was canvassed, block by block, door by door, dorm room by dorm room, and none of it produced a name. Investigators would later say something genuinely chilling about why the case resisted every conventional method thrown at it. The attack appeared to be random. Stephanie did not know her killer. There was no jilted boyfriend to pull in for questioning, no jealous acquaintance, no financial dispute, no relationship of any kind that investigators could trace back to a living, breathing suspect. In cases built on relationships, a spouse, a coworker, a friend with a grudge, detectives have a map to follow. Motive leads to opportunity. Opportunity leads to a name. But in a true stranger abduction, that map simply does not exist. You are not looking for someone who wanted Stephanie Hummer dead specifically. You are looking for a stranger who happened to be in an alley at 2:30 in the morning and who left almost nothing behind except DNA that, in 1994, had nowhere yet to go. That is close to the most difficult kind of case a police department can be handed. Without a suspect to test the DNA against, the sample is inert, useless, not because it lacks value, but because there's no comparison to run it against. And in the meantime, investigators had to work through everything that a case like this normally generates. Every person who had been at the same bars Stephanie visited that night, every friend, every acquaintance, every name that surfaced in even the most tangential way. Each one had to be located, interviewed, and as much as possible eliminated. That is the unglamorous, grinding reality of a stranger abduction investigation. It isn't one dramatic breakthrough after another. It's hundreds of ordinary conversations that lead, one after another, to dead ends, because the person responsible was never in any of those rooms to begin with. He wasn't a friend of a friend. He wasn't someone Stephanie's circle had ever crossed paths with at all. So the leads dried up, one by one. The tips slowed, then nearly stopped. The active investigation, despite what everyone involved would later describe as genuinely exhaustive effort, went cold. For Dan and Sue Hummer, cold did not mean closed. It meant something crueler: waiting, not knowing. Watching years accumulate with their daughter's killer walking free somewhere possibly nearby, possibly living an entirely unremarkable life, holding down a job, raising kids of his own, while they lived with a hole in their family that nothing could fill, and no answer could yet explain. 12 years is a long time to wait for a single name. While the Hummer case sat cold in a filing cabinet, a man named Jonathan J. Gravely was living exactly the kind of unremarkable, ordinary life that no cold case detective would ever have thought to flag. Gravely had grown up in Columbus and graduated from Whetstone High School in 1989, a genuine star athlete in his own right, quarterback on the football team, a standout on the basketball court as well. It's worth sitting with that detail for a second. The man who would eventually be linked to Stephanie's murder wasn't a stranger lurking on the margins of society. He was, by most outward measures, a success story. By the 2000s, he had 2 teenage children, a steady factory job, and eventually a fiancée. Nothing about the shape of his adult life read as dangerous. Nobody in Stephanie's world, and nobody involved in the original 1994 investigation, had ever so much as spoken his name. What finally brought him into the system had nothing to do with the murder at all. It was child support. In 2003, Gravely was indicted on a felony charge, failure to pay child support. He owed the mother of 2 of his children $377 a month and had fallen behind badly enough for it to escalate into a criminal matter. He pleaded guilty to 1 count, was ordered to pay back more than $21,000 in arrears, and received 5 years of probation. Here is the detail that changes the entire trajectory of this case. Under Ohio law, that guilty plea to a felony meant Gravely was now required to submit a DNA sample for the state's database. It had nothing to do with Stephanie Hummer. It had nothing to do with 1994. It was a purely bureaucratic consequence of an unrelated family court matter, decided by a judge who almost certainly had no idea what that swab would eventually connect to. His sample went into Ohio's Combined DNA Index System CODIS. And it sat there, one profile among many, until 2005, when a change in Ohio law expanded exactly which felony probationers were required to be entered into the database. That legislative change closed a gap that had, until then, kept people like Gravely off the very grid Stephanie's killer would eventually be caught on. Once his profile was fully entered, the system did what 12 years of shoe-leather police work had not been able to do. It found a match. In January 2006, CODIS flagged a connection between Jonathan Gravely's DNA profile and the decade-old evidence recovered from the scene of Stephanie Hummer's murder. Detectives, among them Sergeant Michael Woods, who would later confirm to reporters that investigators were working to determine whether additional charges might apply, moved quickly. They tracked Gravely down at his job and arrested him. A 35-year-old man, with no history as a suspect, no connection anyone had drawn to Stephanie Hummer in 12 years of searching, was suddenly standing at the absolute center of one of Columbus's most infamous unsolved murders. Police told the court that Gravely had confessed. His public defender would later dispute how that confession was obtained, signaling a motion to suppress it on the grounds that Gravely's Miranda rights had not been properly waived. Gravely's fiancée, Shay Fontes, gave a different account publicly, defending him to local reporters. She insisted Gravely had only ever admitted to having sex with Stephanie that night, which, she argued, explained the DNA match without requiring a confession to murder. She said he had never confessed to killing her, and that anyone who actually knew John would tell you the same thing, that he was, in her words, a good person. Bond was set at $1 billion. When the figure was read aloud in court, Gravely's family reportedly left the courtroom in tears. For the first time in 12 years, Stephanie Hummer's killer, or at least the man now accused of being her killer, had a face and a name attached to him in open court. The case moved toward trial, and prosecutors made clear from early on that they intended to pursue the death penalty. That possibility hung over every subsequent decision Gravely's defense team made. In September 2007, Jonathan Gravely, now 37 years old, more than a decade removed from the night that would define the rest of his life, appeared in Franklin County Common Pleas Court and pleaded guilty to aggravated murder and kidnapping. As part of the negotiated agreement, prosecutors dropped the rape charge entirely, and the death penalty was taken off the table. He addressed the court directly, in a statement that was brief and, to many who heard it, deeply unsatisfying. It offered no real explanation for what he had done 13 years earlier, and no accounting for why he had stayed silent through 12 years of a family publicly, desperately searching for answers he alone possessed. "I have not lived a life of crime," he told the court, "but what I did on that date was inexcusable. I want to apologize to the Hummer family for what I've done." It was an apology that answered almost nothing. Why Stephanie? Why that alley? That specific night? Whether he had ever crossed paths with her before, or whether it truly was, as investigators believed, a moment of pure random violence against a total stranger. Those questions went into the plea agreement along with the rape charge, and none of them were ever answered in open court. He was sentenced to 25 years to life, with eligibility for parole after 18 years. For a case that prosecutors had once called one of the most intensive investigations in Columbus's history, the resolution arrived not in a dramatic jury verdict, but in a quiet guilty plea, the kind of ending that closes a file without ever fully opening the door on what actually happened, moment by moment, in Pearl Alley 13 years earlier. Plea deals do that. They trade the certainty of a conviction for the finality of a trial, and in doing so, they often leave the people who most need answers with fewer of them than they'd hoped for. In the courtroom, Dan and Sue Hummer made their feelings known, in a statement later reported by the Columbus Dispatch. If Gravely had felt any genuine remorse, they said, he would have come forward on his own, not waited more than a decade to be caught by a DNA database that only found him because of an entirely unrelated child support case. There is no undoing what happened. There is no version of justice that gives Dan and Sue their daughter back. Sue Hummer, holding a photograph of Stephanie at the sentencing hearing, said it in the simplest, heaviest terms she could find. We will live with it for the rest of our lives. She meant every word. Susan Hummer passed away in 2015, having spent the final years of her life not only grieving her daughter, but standing guard over her memory, determined that Jonathan Gravely would never be allowed to quietly complete his sentence and re-enter a life Stephanie never got the chance to build for herself. The Hummer family has continued that fight in the years since Sue's passing. Gravely's most recent parole petition on record was denied in April 2023, nearly 2 decades after his arrest, and almost 30 years after Stephanie's murder. 12 years of not knowing. Then a plea deal that finally answered the who, but never truly answered the why. Then a sentence that, every so often, opens the door again to the possibility of a parole board deciding that Jonathan Gravely has served enough. For a family that waited over a decade just to learn a killer's name, enough is not a word they have ever taken lightly. That kind of long-term vigilance is a version of grief most people never have to learn. It isn't the sharp, immediate pain of the first phone call. It's something slower and more exhausting showing up, year after year, parole hearing after parole hearing, to make sure a name doesn't quietly disappear back into a system that might otherwise let it. Dan Hummer carried that responsibility largely on his own after Sue's death in 2015, continuing to advocate against Gravely's release long after most of the public had forgotten the case existed at all. That is, in its own quiet way, its own kind of justice, not the kind a courtroom hands down once, but the kind a family has to keep fighting for, over and over, for the rest of their lives. Stephanie Hummer's case is, in a lot of ways, a story about time, about how a single piece of evidence recovered in 1994 sat completely useless for 12 years, not because investigators failed her, not because anyone was careless, but because the technology and the law had not yet caught up to what forensic science would eventually be capable of. About how the exact machinery that finally caught her killer had nothing to do with her murder at all. It was triggered by $377 a month in unpaid child support, an entirely separate debt owed to an entirely separate family, adjudicated in an entirely separate courtroom years after Stephanie was gone. There is something almost unbearable sitting inside that detail. The very same law that had nothing whatsoever to do with Stephanie became the only reason her killer was ever identified at all. If Ohio had not expanded its DNA collection requirements for felony probationers in 2005, there is a real, uncomfortable possibility that Jonathan Gravely is still walking free today, and that Dan and Sue Hummer would have died as Sue in fact did, in 2015, without ever learning his name. That is not an abstract point about the justice system. That is the entire spine of this case. It is also, in its own way, a story about how devastating a purely random act of violence against a total stranger can be to investigate. There was no relationship for detectives to map, no motive for them to trace, no thread of jealousy or debt or grievance connecting Stephanie Hummer to Jonathan Gravely, because, as far as anyone has ever established, there wasn't one. He didn't know her. She had no idea he existed. That randomness is precisely what let him disappear back into an ordinary life for 12 years, with nobody suspecting the former high school quarterback with the steady factory job, and the 2 kids, and the fiancé who believed in him. Stephanie Hummer was 18 years old. She ran track. She edited her high school yearbook. She earned her own way to Ohio State on a scholarship built for students who worked for what they had. She had, by every account left behind by the people who knew her, a bright, kind, wide-open future ahead of her. She never got the chance to live a single day of it. And somewhere, right now, in a field outside Columbus, and in a courtroom transcript from 2007, and in a photograph a mother held on to, until the day she herself died, that is what remains of this case. Not a complete answer to why, just the record of who Stephanie Hummer was, and the 12 long years it took the state of Ohio to finally say her killer's name out loud. Thank you so much for watching Missing Truth. If this story moved you, shocked you, or gave you something to think about, please leave your thoughts in the comments below. We read every comment, and your perspective matters. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys true crime documentaries.